We're going to talk about writing, electronic form, and interpretation of contracts. Basically, contracts that have to be in writing. So we're going to deal with the statute of frauds. The statute of frauds includes those contracts that are required to be in writing. Remember that as a general rule, contracts do not have to be in writing, but those contracts that fall within the statute of frauds are considered to be so important that they are required to be in writing. If they're not in writing, they're not enforceable. So there are certain contracts that do fall within the statute of frauds. Those contracts include contracts that involve the sale of land. So if you're dealing with the sale of a home, that would include or the sale of land. Home would be the real property. It would be attached to the real property. As a general rule, that would need to be in writing unless you have the part performance exception. And I'm going to talk about each of these separately in just a second. Contracts that cannot, by their terms, be performed within 1 year from the date of termination. So contracts that by the terms cannot possibly be performed within 1 year. Collateral or secondary agreements where someone's answering personally to the creditors for the debt of another person that is either alive or as an executive estate of a person who is a decedent or no longer living. Promises made in consideration of marriage, and for the sale of goods of $500 or more if you're following the Uniform Commercial Code. Now, as far as contracts involving an interest in land, a contract involving an interest in land is not enforceable unless there is some type of writing or memorandum. There is an exception. This is called the part performance exception. And the part performance exception is when the land contract does not have to be in writing. You have to either see the buyer moving onto the land, which is taking possession of the land and making improvements to the land, or the buyer moving onto the land and making some type of payment towards the purchase price of the land. If you see the one of those two situations, then the sale of land will be enforceable even though it's not in writing. The 1 year rule. A contract that by its terms cannot possibly be performed within 1 year must be in writing. The year runs from the time of the making of the contract to the date of the end of the contract. So it goes from the time the contract is made to the end, and it does not start at the date of performance. It starts at the date the contract is made. Sometimes the date of performance is at the same time, sometimes it's not. With 1 year contracts, I have to mention that at will contracts, contracts where there are no terms, those contracts do not have to be in writing, and lifetime contracts for entire life do not have to be in writing. They don't fall within the statute of frauds because it's possible that someone may not live within or may die within a year. Collateral agreements or secondary agreements where you're agreeing to answer personally for the debt of another person. Um, this is basically like a cosigner agreement, or where an executive estate who is not responsible for answering for the debt of the estate is agreeing to answer personally for the debt of the estate. If that happens, the agreement must be in writing to be enforceable because it falls within the statute of frauds. Contracts that fall within the statute of frauds have to be in writing. Contracts that fall outside of the statute of frauds do not have to be in writing. If a contract is made in consideration of marriage, like a prenuptial agreement, it would need to be in writing. Contracts for the sale of goods for $500 or more need to be in writing. Notice that for the sale of goods, there is a monetary amount. For the sale of land, it doesn't matter the amount of land that the land is sold for. If it deals with the sale of land and there's not a part performance exception, it would need to be in writing because it falls within the statute of frauds. The sale of goods for less than $500 would not need to be in writing. The question then becomes, is the writing sufficient? Is there enough in the writing? To be sufficient, the writing must be signed by the party to be charged. In other words, the writing does not have to be signed by both parties. It's the party who is trying to get out of the contract or is claiming that the contract is unenforceable because it's not in writing. If that person has signed the contract, it will be enforceable as to that person. In other words, whoever has signed the contract will be held to it. A contract does not have to be formal. It can be a letter, it can be a memoranda, as long as it has the necessary details or requirements in that contract that need to be there. If you're dealing with a sale of land, you would need to have the buyer and also a description or description of the land or tract of land. If you have a writing and it's considered to be complete, then the parole evidence rule will apply. The parole evidence rule says that, and it applies to written contracts, that if there is a written contract that is considered to be the complete agreement between the parties, parole or outside evidence cannot be brought in to contradict the terms of the written contract if the evidence deals with something that came prior to or contemporaneous at the same time that the writing was made. It will be inadmissible to change the terms. The reason is because if the agreement came before, prior to, or contemporaneous at the same time as the actual written contract, then that should have been put in the contract. The parole evidence basically means outside words or speech, and it also can include an agreement that came before the actual writing. And the purpose is to restrict evidence from being admitted that substantially changes or contradicts the writing. There are exceptions to the parole evidence rule. Parole evidence or outside evidence can be used to show fraud or mistake or duress. It also can be used if the written contract is ambiguous, means it has more than one meaning, or confusing. It can be shown that there is a later modification of a contract. So if you're trying to bring in evidence of something that happened after the contract is made, that will be allowed. It's dealing with things that come before or at the same time that the writing is made. Ordinary words are to be interpreted according to their original meaning. As a general rule, if there are some technical or trade terms that are used in the contract, you can use the technical meaning of those words or the trade meaning of those words. A contract must be construed in whole in such a way that every part is given effect. When a contract is partly a printed form or partly typewritten and partly handwritten, and the written part conflicts with the printed part or typewritten part, the handwritten part will prevail. So handwritten prevails over typewritten. When there's a conflict between a printed part, which is generated off of the computer, and a typewritten part, the typewritten part prevails because it takes more effort. We're talking about something that was through a typewriter, used the actual typewriter versus a computer.